Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's discussion hosted by the Trade Justice Movement on the trade system that we nearly got. Many of you will, of course, be familiar of the trade system that we have at the moment, based on GATS and its successor, the World Trade Organization, focusing on, of course, the principles of free trade, market liberalism, and of course, its latest iteration of neoliberalism. But it didn't have to be like that, and it wasn't always planned to be like that. There have been two periods where reform has been suggested. Of course, the original Bretton Woods organizations. There was the International Trade Organization planned, which would have balanced things out much more. Then reform later on was suggested in the 70s, where again, there would be the absolute right to nationalize resources, and it would balance the idea of produced goods, raw materials, and the benefits shared equally. Unsurprisingly, they were prevented by interest in the global north from achieving reality. But that doesn't mean that we can't take inspiration from some of those struggles, understand some of the detail of which was proposed, and how we can continue to try and weave in those elements into our future of trade. Understanding our past, hopefully, is the best way of getting trade justice in our future. This is a discussion hosted, as I said, by the Trade Justice Movement, and the Trade Justice Movement is a UK coalition of nearly 60 civil society organisations with millions of individual members. It has been foremost in lobbying at the UK, but also at the international level, for fair trade, trade that focuses on environment and human rights, and trade that includes trade unions, people and planet coming together and ensuring there is not a disparity between the global north and global south, with the aim of trade should be to improve people, not to improve the pockets of the very wealthy. Of course, it is an anniversary of the Trade Justice Movement at the moment, and this is part of a series of discussions that are being held. My name is Lloyd Russell Moyle. I'm the Member of Parliament for Brighton, Kemp Town and Peacehaven. I served until the government abolished us on the International Trade Committee, and I'm currently leading with the Constitutional Affairs Committee the inquiry into how trade deals and trade negotiations are scrutinised in Britain, how we make sure that comprehensive trade deals are not just put through on the nod, and we can have some of the worst processes of embedding rather aggressive neoliberalism. Well, that's my aim. Of course, I've got to persuade Conservatives that we need to change the scrutiny system for slightly other reasons, possibly. But anyway, that's enough about me and about the broad gist of the panel. You are here today to listen to, of course, some of the speakers. Each speaker will have about 10 minutes. I will try and keep time, and afterwards we will have some short questions from the audience. We'll try and do questions. I'll be generous and sometimes allow short statements as well, because they can provoke discussion, but we won't be opening up to long statements from other people who are not panelists, I'm afraid. So first of all, I'm going to ask Francine Mackenzie, who is an international historian and professor at Western University, Canada. She specialises in international organisations, 20th century global trade, and the British Commonwealth, with a particular interest in efforts of people, groups, and governments, including those of smaller countries, and how they cooperate. She's an author of several books, including GATT and the Global Order in the Post-War Era, and she's currently researching the gap between discourse and action on liberalising the 20th century trade. Francine, over to you and your 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Lloyd. I'm very pleased to be joining you today. My remarks are very historical, since I am a historian, and I will discuss the short but I think important history of the International Trade Organization, one of the part of the trade system we nearly got. As Lloyd mentioned, the International Trade Organization, or the ITO, was supposed to take its place alongside the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And the idea was that together they would support a global economy that was stable, connected, and growing. I think it's very much part of the story of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, about which, as Lloyd mentioned, I've written a book. And that we can think of as the trade order that we got, but we weren't supposed to. It was, I think, a historical accident. And I hope that some of these remarks are relevant to the way we think about trade today. So I'm going to ask you to cast your minds back to the 1940s, to the Second World War, when officials, politicians, and civil society experts and academics were thinking about what had caused the war and how they could prevent another such war. And in these discussions, the economic roots of conflict figured prominently. Now, for many people, they turned to the Great Depression, to that experience, and were determined that that we wouldn't repeat that experience. But they also looked to it as an explanation for how the Second World War had begun. For instance, people thought that the deprivation and desperation prompted by the Great Depression, which in turn prompted governments to close markets with injurious effects for other countries, other producers, other consumers, that had contributed to the decline of international relations. There was a general turning inwards and a lack of faith or belief in international cooperation. And this exacerbated resentment among states, which was part of the background, the context that led to the Second World War. And the understanding amongst many of these people, not all, they're not uniform in their beliefs, but many of them, was that peace and prosperity would go hand in hand. That if you had a global economy that was growing and stable, then there wouldn't be another war. Now, in these wartime discussions about the economy and the economic roots of conflict, there were also many critics of capitalism and the social ills that it caused. And these critics included political leaders, economists, religious leaders, and social reformers, labor activists, and they called for things like job security, guaranteed fair wages, financial security in old age, fair prices, the dignified treatment of workers, and removing profit as a motivation for business. In addition, I think there was another strand of discussion about exploitative monopoly capitalism and the way that was integral to the practices of imperialism that led to the exploitation of labor. So there was and of people living in colonies. So there was a wide-ranging discussion about the economy and the global economy and the trade system in the 1940s. And there was an understanding or a belief that trade could be part of a solution to a better world, but also it could be the cause of harm and social ill. All right, so we're still in the 1940s, and governments in the wartime alliance that ended up winning, they began to plan for the post-war world. And the British and American governments were at the forefront in planning or laying out the blueprint for the International Trade Organization. This was not a straightforward process. There were fundamental disagreements about many issues, and I'll just tell you about one, which was full employment. Now, the concern about full employment was very much linked to the experience of the Great Depression. And there was a widespread concern during the war that when the war ended, there would be massive unemployment again, and we would return to depression-like conditions. So many believed that full employment needed to be part of the objectives of the new trade system. For American officials, the way they reasoned was that if you had interconnections, if goods were flowing around the world and the economy was growing, then you would get full employment. But not everyone reasoned in the same way. And I think the Australian government was actually particularly important in this, in pushing for a full employment agenda. And the reasoning of their economic advisors was that first you had to ensure everyone had the means to consume. They needed to have stable, well-paying jobs first, and then that would lubricate international trade. There are all kinds of disagreements over how the actual trade system would work. And I think behind these disagreements, there were different conceptions of the global order and its priorities. Now, the discussions about the International Trade Organization became so fractious that they were set aside in 1943. And meanwhile, the world went ahead and they planned the Bretton Woods agreements. And the discussions about international trade were postponed until after the war had come to an end. They began again in about 1946. And these trade negotiations or discussions increasingly widened to include more countries. There were 24 by the time they really were shaping the International Trade Agreement's draft charter was coming into fruition. They focused a lot on reducing tariffs and other barriers to trade and curtailing the use of protectionist practices like quantitative restrictions. But they also addressed the concerns of developing countries that were present at these meetings, like India, and they were introducing measures, so qualifications that would, or provisions that would allow for practices like the protection of new industries. There was a major trade conference in 1947 in Geneva, where the ITO's draft charter was tinkered with, not changed fundamentally at that point. And the first set of trade negotiations were held. And at the end of that conference, the results of the trade negotiations, along with a small section of the ITO draft charter, which was called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, it was hived off. They were bundled together and introduced or ratified by various governments as a way to get the trade system going, the post-war trade system going. But it was not meant to be the final product. It was an interim measure. And the final conference was held in Havana from 1947 to 1948. 56 countries were present at this conference, and the global South was represented, much more fully than it had been earlier. Now, despite the fact that there had been consultations in 46 and 47, where there had been changes made to the draft charter to make it more, I suppose, relevant or applicable to different countries with different economic situations and aspirations, the draft charter came in for full-scale criticism. There were discussions about how, as Lloyd was saying earlier, free trade was not always fair. This discussion happened in 1947-48, and that the trade system as it was being envisaged and implemented would prolong systemic exploitation and economic marginalization. There were arguments made about how removing barriers to trade would undermine attempts to industrialize by many countries. And there was a discussion about economic inequality. 800 amendments were proposed to the ITO draft charter, many of them made, and they included things like permitting regional trade agreements, permitting preferential trade agreements as well, more measures to protect industrialization, as well as curbing foreign investment speculation. And the whole trade charter was radically rewritten. It was then called the Havana Draft. And development became its primary purpose, not reducing barriers to trade. And development was defined not in terms of economic growth, but as the productive use of the world's human and material resources. Okay, so what was the reaction to the Havana Charter? In many ways, it was not well liked. The representatives from Chile and Colombia criticized it, saying it was too uniform and generic. It had a one-size approach, which didn't work. The official from Mexico said that the trade charter and its efforts would be judged by what happened next. And he said, quote, there was a need for the economically stronger countries to cooperate altruistically in the work of speedily improving the standards of living of weak countries. Very much reflecting, I think, a post-colonial perspective and reasoning. The governments of France, Britain, and Canada regarded the ITO draft, the charter, as a compromise. They didn't like it, but they thought they had to support it because if they did not, it would be a blow to the recovery that was happening after the Second World War. Surprisingly, American officials were very enthusiastic. The chief American negotiator, a man named Will Clayton, described the end of the Havana Conference as, quote, a day for history. This may well prove to be the greatest step in history toward order and justice in economic relations among the members of the world community. And another senior American official was so optimistic, he said, the Havana steamroller cannot be stopped. Well, he was wrong. And for a number of reasons, and I think some of the other presenters will go into those reasons more fully than I will, but the ITO didn't happen. Partly that was because there was too much of a focus on development. The Cold War had emerged as a priority. There was short-term thinking that returned, and I think the ITO was badly managed by American officials. So the ITO didn't happen, and it meant the world was left with the GATT, this interim piecemeal measure. Now, the GATT has been called, or was called repeatedly, and I think with good reason, a rich man's club. It perpetuated privilege and marginalization as part of, the mandate was not to do that, but that was the effect of some of its activities. But the failure of the ITO and the fact we were left with the GATT, I don't think meant that development and the conception of trade that informed development, of which economic justice and equity was a fundamental part, I don't think that ceased to be a priority for the GATT. I don't want to make the case that the GATT was terribly effective in promoting economic justice. I don't think it was. But in the GATT discussions and its trade rounds, development was accepted as a legitimate objective of trade. So the failure still had implications and meaning and resonance for the GATT and its members moving forward. And you can see this in efforts in the 1950s to try to reconstitute the ITO with those provisions that had been so important to development in the global south. It failed. In the 1960s, the rules of trade negotiations were altered a little bit to try to take account of the fact that not all participants in trade negotiations approached it from the same positions of advantage. And in the 1970s, so as the NIO was moving forward, there was a long round of trade negotiations in the GATT called the Tokyo Round. They started in 1973, just before the NIO. But it was remarkable at the start of this round, there was a ministerial declaration that basically acknowledged the logic of the NIO. And they acknowledged that the world trade system privileged the economically and politically strong and hindered the economic growth of developing countries. So my concluding thoughts. This is a story, the ITO and all these attempts to make development matter in GATT. It's a story of frustration, not success, but it's also a story, I think, of paths not taken, but they might have been. And these possibilities endured. And I also think something did change, even if on the surface it might not have been apparent. And that's that a development or global south or post-colonial perspective of international trade was widely accepted and agreed with and affirmed. That the trade system could perpetuate injustice and exploitation and inequality was widely accepted. And GATT and its members became in some ways publicly accountable for their shortcomings. So I think we should ask why the GATT was not more successful or more effective in promoting development. And the answer has many parts, but it's not that the ideas themselves were too radical or objectionable. And I'll stop there.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that. And I think it was really great to bring us up to speed to some extent, at least the 1970s. And you're mentioning there, of course, the end around the new international economic order, the latter proposals, but that started with UNCTAD as well, and the creation of UNCTAD. And so that possibly helps move us on to our next speaker, Abhijit Das, who has more than 2 decades of experience in international trade, including in trade policy making in the government of India, with India program, and the head of Center of World Trade Organization studies in New Delhi. He has participated directly in many multilateral and FTA negotiations, including the Doha Round, and is editor of several books on trade and published extensively in national and international journals. His current interests include agriculture, digital economy, sustainability, geographical indications, and negotiating strategies for global value chains. Look, fantastically impressive CV. Can you pick up where we have just left off with Francine and your thoughts for 10 minutes?
Thank you, Chair. I'm grateful to the organizers for organizing this series of 3 webinars. It's very, very important that we reflect on issues like trade justice. Professor Francine has made my task relatively easier. She's laid the ground about what happened at the ITO. But before I delve into that, we need to remind ourselves that we are now at a very critical juncture when, in the name of WTO reform, a handful of powerful countries are seeking to tilt the multilateral trading system, which already is fairly asymmetric, tilt it further against the interests of developing countries. And at this juncture, the civil society organizations will have to play a very important role in resisting these efforts. Hence, the webinar series is really timely and relevant. Let me pick up the threads from where Francine left. Francine mentioned that the ITO was agreed in Havana in 1948. What happened thereafter? Why did the ITO sink? Well, the United States was the pivotal player in the establishment of the International Trade Organization. And the US President Truman, he was expected to submit the draft draft Havana Charter for ratification by the US Congress, but he failed to do so. And with US failing to be part of the ITO, it was quite predictable that the organization lost steam, and without the participation of the United States, the ITO really was stillborn. But why did ITO sink, and what are the lessons? I'm going to rely a bit on a fascinating history of the GATT, written by Professor Francine McKenzie, as well as a book called The Globalist, written by another historian, Quinn Slobodian. Now, what emerges from the writings of Quinn Slobodian is that the cozy relationship between big corporate lobby groups, represented primarily by the International Chamber of Commerce, and a group of influential academics who are now popularly referred to as the Geneva School of Neoliberals. These two worked in harmony to make sure that the ITO actually sank. Now, let's recall that the United States really was at the forefront of getting a few aspects of the ITO draft cherry-picked and established the GATT. Now, GATT was premised on the principles of free trade, tariff liberalization, whereas ITO really had development at its forefront. Now, the final draft of the ITO marked a subtle shift in priority. It included exceptions for quantitative restrictions. It provided a provision to stabilize price of primary commodities. Interests of many developing countries appeared to have prevailed, but actually they didn't. Now, what really happened was that the International Chamber of Commerce was very actively involved in the negotiations of ITO. But once the ITO Charter enshrined the right to deviate from the orthodoxy of free trade in order to protect nascent industries against foreign competition, the ICC became extremely active, even stridently opposing the ITO. It viewed the Havana Charter as, quote, a dangerous document, and characterized the Havana Charter as, again, I quote, the first international charter of economic nationalism ever written in the history of civilized world, unquote. The ICC official position was that the ITO would, again, quote, not infringe enough on the sovereignty of signatories, unquote. Further, the one country, one vote procedure drew particular ire of the ICC. And ICC led a very strong campaign against the ITO. And this campaign of ICC was led in partnership with a few neoliberal economists. Who were these neoliberal economists? Interestingly, if we turn to Quinn Slobodian, he identifies William Rappard as the nucleus of forming this Geneva School of Neoliberal Economists, which included economists such as Ludwig von Mises, Michael Heil-Perrin, Gottfried Haberler, etc., etc. Now, some key personalities belonging to the Geneva School appear to have shared and partially adopted the global perspectives from the International Chamber of Commerce. And this is not surprising, as some of them had been previously employed by the ICC during 1920s and 1930s. And even subsequently, they retained very strong links with this organization. Now, many of the activities of the Geneva School of Neoliberals, particularly establishment of what is now known as the Mont Pelerin Society, really was funded by big industrialists who were part of the ICC. In other words, the intertwining of the Geneva School of Neoliberals and the ICC appears to explain the remarkable convergence in their objectives and perspectives regarding global economic integration. And once the Geneva School of Neoliberals and the ICC in tandem started opposing the International Trade Organization, there was a complete vacuum, a complete absence of a forceful development-centered counter-narrative. And predictably, after the submissions made by ICC to the US Congress, the US president really would have felt very discouraged to submit the Havana Charter for ratification. Now, what we witnessed in the context of ITO appears to have become the template whereby some intergovernmental organizations, a few universities, a few think tanks appear to have almost been completely co-opted to aggressively promote the commercial interests of the developed countries, initially at the GATT and subsequently at the WTO. A closely coordinated insider network appears to be functioning, which is aimed at promoting the commercial interests of big corporates by, at times, couching them in terms of human rights. This appears to be a recurrent theme in the armory of the Geneva School. Just to take a tangential story, when the debate around international investment agreements started, that debate was anchored in human rights of capital. And what we are seeing today is an attempt to anchor completely mercantilist objectives, again around human rights. But that was a tangential observation. Now, coming back to this cozy nexus, cozy relationship between academicians, researchers, and big corporate group, an interesting perspective is provided by Robert House, who's an eminent legal expert. According to Robert House, and I'm quoting him here, the administration and incremental development of the trading system was entrusted to a specialized policy elite, insulated from and not particularly interested in the larger political, social conflicts of the age, unquote. House is of the view that this group of insider network included officials employed in GATT WTO Secretariat, some former or current government trade officials, GATT-friendly academicians, international civil servants from other organizations, particularly World Bank, OECD, IMF, etc., who were preoccupied with trade matters. Of course, Rob House hastens to add, and that's an important point to bear in mind, that he is not suggesting any conspiracy theory. He views this insider network as an epistemic community. And for this insider network, free trade became the ideology, and it became indifferent to any notion of just distribution of benefits and burdens from the removal of trade restrictions. For the insider network, the prescription of free trade was initially viewed as a timeless truth. However, over time, this insider network appears to have undertaken a somersault, and it has shown considerable intellectual flexibility in crafting narratives to promote commercial interests of developed countries on issues which seek to restrict trade, mainly the non-trade issues. But again, the insider network appears to have been fairly flexible in its intellectual orientation. What is the lesson from all this? We've seen how the rules of the GATT were expanded to support and reflect the changing sectors of economic strengths in the developed countries, how the GATT transitioned into the WTO by including rules on intellectual property rights, rules on services. Now, the narrative spun to promote the commercial interests of large corporates based mainly in the developed world. These narratives are visible even today. And an important part of this narrative is to depict concessions to developing countries as decay in the rules-based global economy. So in this context, CSOs have a very important role to play in providing a development-centric narrative on many of the issues that are relevant, that are current in the trade negotiations, be it at the WTO, be it in the FTAs. And the insider network, which Rob House has talked of, or which Quinn Slobodian has mentioned, is very vibrant, is evident, and in a way, they seem to be driving the negotiating agenda. One way of countering this negotiating agenda is to come up with our own development-centric narrative. And I'm going to stop at that, and I'd be very happy to answer questions later. Thank you, Chair.
Perfect. And thank you very, very much there. I think it's important that we understand who is influencing the current thinking around trade negotiations and the proliferation of these free trade bilaterals, bypassing multilaterals, bypassing, of course, elements of justice that people in the global south might be trying to put into the system. Our next speaker is Intan Sawandi, anti-imperialist scholar and assistant professor of sociology at Illinois State University. Her award-winning book, Value Chains and New Economic Imperialism, examines exploitation of labor in the global south by northern multinational companies. Her wider research explores international political economy, global development, and social stratification, and she is the co-author of the pioneering work that qualifies the $1 trillion value of the North-South unequal exchange. Really important work there, Intan. I wonder if you can give us your 10 minutes thought on this topic.
Thank you. And I'm going to share my screen here. Thank you for this opportunity. So Francine and Abhijit have delivered a very important historical background that I think is the bulk of this series today. And one important takeaway from that history is, I think, the imperialist relation between global North and global South, including trade relations. And I want to start with that, with imperialism. So imperialism is rooted in the logic of capitalism, right? It has accompanied the development of capitalism since the very beginning. But on the other hand, the current economic imperialism also has different characteristics. It is often referred to as the new globalization, started in the 1970s. But of course, it is also related to that logic of capitalism, rooted in the historical development of capitalism. Harry McDuff, U.S. economist, traces the evolution of imperialism in relation to the colonial relationship between the core and the periphery, especially after the rise of European industries in the 1870s, for example. The colonies serve as the suppliers of both raw materials and foodstuffs to Europe, right, as well as new captive markets. And of course, this relationship continued even after processes of decolonization. The core countries tried to maintain the imperialist relationship between them and the periphery to control the raw material supply. and all the trade and investment opportunities, both through direct and indirect means. And the periphery or the third world has had numerous resistance against this dependency, of course. And both what Francine and Abhijit explained as a part of this resistance. And so I'm not going to talk a lot about that, of course. But I do want to mention that the developmentalism as a form of resistance from the third world came out from the 1955 Bandung Conference. Bandung is my hometown, and the non-aligned movement. And even though this movement, the participants of this movement came from a wide political spectrum, but it was an anti-imperialist movement. So, you know, UNCTAD came out from developmentalism, and also, you know, G77's new international economic order came out from that, and of course something like G7. That was a backlash, right, from the global north, as a response to G77. And as a part of this backlash is, of course, the creation of debt. And as a result, the third world debt crisis and the newer development was, of course, structural adjustment policies, and we all know the story. So the third world debt crisis and the role of international financial institutions, IMF, World Bank, and the really devastating consequences of structural adjustment policies in the third world is a part of the background of the new globalization, the incorporation of the global south to the world economy, the opening of the market, the investments, the foreign direct investments, and so on. So there are other political and other backgrounds to this that I cannot talk about, but this is a part of what allowed the new globalization to be created. But basically, the new globalization is the current economic this current economic globalization is marked by the incorporation of nation states into the world capitalist economy through the opening of markets and trade liberalization. It is characterized by three main things. One is a dramatic increase in trade and FDI flows, especially to the developing economies, and an accelerating pace of offshoring or outsourcing, especially in manufacturing. And I'm going to talk more about this later. And also, as a result, the concentration of world industrial workers in the global south. And of course, we know that global production doesn't happen in the global north anymore. So when we talk about outsourcing, offshoring, this is what we call arm's length contracts. It's a form of subcontracting where multinationals outsource production to suppliers, usually in the global south, through contractual relationships without equity involvement. And this is a major form of trade. And it has generated, for example, it generated $2 trillion in sales in 2010 alone. At some point, the world economy grew less than arm's length trade. So this is an example, of course, of a company that does arm's length trade. Apple, right, doesn't manufacture anything. And this is a commodity chains of an iPhone. And as you can see, these are companies that make iPhone, and Apple is not in it. So global commodity chains that mark global production, they're very complex, decentralized networks. And it is known that no CEO in this world knows the complete map of their global commodity chains because it is so complex. However, there's a pattern: global labor arbitrage. This is a term that can be defined as replacing higher wage labor with lower wage labor with similar productivities. So this is what corporations, multinational corporations do. And they can do this because of the imperfect global market arises from a system that allows for relatively free international mobility of capital while tightly restricting the international mobility of labor. Because capital can move freely, right, globally, while labor cannot. They're still confined within national borders because of immigration policies and so on. So this is what actually happened. Companies replace higher wage labor with lower wage labor, but with similar productivities. So if you see, this is an index of unit labor costs, we call it, and this is only in manufacturing, but this is just to give you an idea that there's a gap between unit labor costs in the global north countries and in the global south countries. And unit labor cost is just a measurement that combines both wage and productivities. But this is the pattern that multinational corporations are looking for: low unit labor cost. Because the jobs in global commodity chains are not just going anywhere, right? They go to places where unit labor costs are low. But what is exactly global labor arbitrage? For people in the business circles, for global north representatives, they call it, a strategy, right? A corporate strategy, a survival tool. But it is not just a survival tool. It is basically an equal exchange. It is a part of the logic of capital accumulation and to pursue higher profits. And that's the reason behind global labor arbitrage. This is a form of unequal exchange where the difference in wages between the North and the South is greater than the difference in productivities. Through this process, the Northern-based multinationals get more labor for less and benefit from high markups on low-cost labor with similar productivities in the South, while the excess surplus obtained is often misleadingly attributed to innovative, quote-unquote, financial and value extractive economic activities taking place in the North. At its core, of course, global labor arbitrage is a quest for valorization. It is a strategy for both reducing socially necessary labor costs and maximizing the appropriation of surplus value. We have to note that unequal exchange indicates a hidden transfer of value on a global scale. And of course, labor is only a part of the story here. There are other aspects of it, including energy, land, and raw materials. And through this process, drain, we call it, where the surplus of an economy is sucked out without an expected return of advantages. And this is an old story, of course, it's still going on, flows from the South to the North. And in a paper that I co-authored and was published in Global Environmental Change last year, it was estimated that, within the period of 1990 to 2015, the drain from the South to the North reached about $242 trillion. But yeah, focusing again on labor, studies show that global commodity chain jobs are concentrated in countries with low unit labor cost, right, as we saw before. So this unequal exchange is closely related to value capture. And this is made possible by the formation of monopolies, which enables the capitalist centers to appropriate large shares of the surplus generated elsewhere. Because production today happens mainly in the global South, and exploitation rate is higher there due to this low unit labor cost. And in many countries in the South that have become production, especially assembly centers where products are assembled, labor values generated by production are captured and not registered as arising in the South. It's not registered in their GDP due to asymmetries in power relations. And of course, on the macro level, right, this is dependency. We can see that this does not reflect a dispersion of power. This is not decentralized power. Capitalist imperialism is characterized by the process whereby the dominated areas, it is the global south, are transformed, adapted, and manipulated to serve the imperatives of capital accumulation in the center. So especially with manufacturing, for example, the firm level transformations are often parachuted in with no real organic relation to or logic stemming from the emerging economy and are just easily dismantled and removed. Capital can leave any time, right, as we know it. Okay, and so this creates an illusion of development and advanced production in the southern countries, although in reality, they remain in a dependent condition. But I do want to, have a concluding remark here, but struggles continue. And global south remain, they resist all the time. So I'll close my presentation here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I think it's really important to understand how the exploitation is continued not just by governments, but by the economic order that is perpetuated by very often multinational corporations trying to gain profit under the guise of innovation, but really in the reality of exploitation. I can see that one person has put a question in the Q&A chat. This is open now. After Joshua, we will come to the chat and we will answer those questions. So if you have a Q&A question, something's come to you during the talk, put it in there. I will read out those questions and we will come back to each of the speakers to answer them at the end. But without further ado, Joshua Mata is the General Secretary of Centro, one of the Philippines' biggest, representing over 80,000 workers. He is the leading voice on trade policy focused on the potential impacts on industries, jobs, and workers of shrinking government policy space through trade union agreements. As a trade union sponsored member of parliament here in Britain, I know how important it is to hear that voice, particularly around the role that solidarity between trade unions across the world plays in understanding how our economic order ends up screwing over, probably undiplomatically, both workers in the global north and the global south very often. And we all end up losing out. So Joshua Mata, over to you.
Thank you, Lloyd, and thank you to Intan and the previous speakers, because definitely what I'm going to present to you is a country, the Philippines, as an example on how the economy has actually screwed the workers. Thank you for that word, Lloyd. At least I'm allowed to say that. So I'd also like to add to the discussion that I think it's important for us to trace the problem all the way back during the time of colonialism. And as you know, the Philippines has experienced 300 years. As we say, the Philippines was under the Spanish rule for 300 years, and then later on by the Americans, the United States of America, for 50 years. So we have a saying that we were under 300 years in the convent, and then we experienced 50 years of Hollywood. So that's the Philippines, and in all this period, since the decolonization of many countries like the Philippines who were colonized by the global north, specific countries in the global north, it is important to note that the kind of the trade that emerged from out of the decolonialization period is essentially the kind of trade that will keep the corporations and the global north's power over the global south, and that's how we feel the trade system is up to until today. There was so shifting a bit there was a time where in the Philippines, despite the fact that it is part of a very dependent economy to imperial centers, there was a time that the Philippines was second to Japan in terms of industrial production, when we were still using an ISI model, or import substitution model. By its own problems, having its own internal problems, the country was shifted to an export-oriented model, which then turned us into a re-export platform, with a lot of export processing zones being introduced. But then, under the Marcos dictatorship, which plundered the country and this is the first Marcos regime that we're talking about in the 1960s and 70s, under the Marcos dictatorship, which plundered the country and brought our economy to its knees, it forced us to liberalize, to deregulate, and to privatize through the structural adjustment programs that were introduced, that were forced on us by the IFIs, the various IFIs that you have, the IMF, World Bank, and even ADB. And thus, I would argue that even before we joined the WTO, the whole idea of what turned out to be Washington Consensus was already well established. The very idea of free trade was firmly held by our economic managers, to the point that even today, despite the fact that free trade thinking, neoliberal thinking and free trade thinking is now being questioned, our economic managers continue to hang on to these debunk ideas and run our economy using these ideas. No, but however, when we joined the WTO, it was a key moment for us as it launched the trade justice campaign in the Philippines. The WTO and the FTAs were actually the ones that gave birth to the key ideas that we continue to fight for today. And these are the need to have an activist state that can actually intervene in the economy through regulations and even through its own public services and utilities, the need for an industrial policy with all the lessons that we could learn from our own neighbors that have turned their economies into tiger economies. And then finally, the need for hard laws for things that are really important for us, such as labor rights, environment, and climate justice. These are the things that the trade justice campaign in the Philippines and in many other countries are holding on. Why did this came out? Well, because the WTO and subsequent free trade agreements that we had proved that free trade doesn't work for workers. Rather than improve our agriculture, it turned out that we now have an agricultural crisis where we became reliant on imports on many of the things that we need to do, including rice. We're now one of the world's biggest rice importers. Second, rather than have industrialization, what we experience is a series of several decades of the industrialization, and now whatever industrial development that we have is part of is closely integrated to the global supply chain, where we practically just provide cheap labor. And therefore, rather than having decent jobs, what we have is a cheap labor policy that's kept in place for decades through trade union repression. That is why, so the Philippines, that's why the Philippines is for 7 consecutive years has been considered by the ITUC as one of the top 10 worst countries in the world for 7 consecutive years. And that is also why the trade justice campaign, but now let me shift to what we have experienced. Where I have been doing trade campaigning for 3 decades, and I have to say that it has gone a long way in mainstreaming what used to be a marginal idea. Before, criticizing free trade is thought of as a marginal thing. It is thought of as something that that the left, only the left, actually believes in. Today, many people now know that because of WTO, the failures of the WTOs and the free trade agreements that we had, even politicians now are worried about just adopting a free trade agreement without a big debate. In fact, I would even say that the IPEF, I don't know if people in your part of the world know what IPEF is the Indo-Pacific framework agreement that's now being pushed. Actually, that is now a reflect that the fact that you have an IPEF being pushed by Biden, which doesn't contain the atrocious elements of investor-state dispute settlement, dispute mechanisms, without a government procurement, without even forcing a lowering of tariffs. This non-traditional FTA, which Biden loves calling as worker-centered trade policy, which I doubt if it is actually a worker trade-centered policy, is actually still a reflection of the fact that free trade agreements have been completely destroyed by campaigners all throughout. So that is why in the Philippines now we are able to we're not able to stop free trade agreements like the recent RCEP, which is the Regional Economic Cooperation Economic Framework for RCEP, or Regional Comprehensive Economic Framework. We were not able to stop the government from ratifying it, but we were able to delay them to do so for years. And when they finally had to ratify it, we were able to force the parliament to come up with a senatorial oversight committee that would now allow us to review RCEP, in the years to come. So that I'm just saying that the trade campaigning in the country has gone a long way already. But having said that, there's still a lot of things that we need to do. Why? Well, because there are several things because there are so many issues that the working class have been facing. Now, when you're so busy dodging bullets and just to try to build your union so that you can fight for a decent job and a decent wage, then things like climate justice and trade justice, these are things that would not necessarily take the front seat in any trade union agenda. But having said that, because now people are starting to realize that the free trade agreements are no longer just about lowering tariffs, because we now have very low tariffs in the Philippines because of the ideological belief of our economic managers that a free trade is a panacea. They just unilaterally lowered all our tariffs, which prevents us now from developing our industries. But because of our low tariffs, now people understand that the free trade agreements that we're trying to enter into are now more about giving more rights to corporations. It's about locking in all these rights so that we can no longer regulate them. Whether in the traditional economy or even in the big tech realm, if you like. So these are so that's why there is a need for the labor movement to continue its campaigns. But we have three major challenges. Now, if I may shift to the last point, but we have three more major challenges. One is the fact that many workers, ordinary workers, still lack the basic information about how free trade could actually harm them specifically. As I said, the trade union movement has to campaign for attention of the workers, and therefore we need to do a lot of education work for them. And this is a challenge, because how do you actually do education in a situation where the working class, the attention span of workers are actually reduced to the 30-second span of TikTok? So that's a big challenge for us. No? The second is capacity. There's so many issues. There's so many problems that we have to campaign on while we're even fighting trade union repression. Now we need, at the same time, we now need to build more capacity for leaders to understand how trade actually impacts our lives, particularly our labor rights. And finally, and this is, I think, the more important point, is that how do we actually, what's the vision that we actually sell to the working class? We know that the FTAs and the WTO and the vision that it presents has failed. But then I still believe that we still have to develop and a more popular and sell the idea that a better world is out there. But what it means, how it will look like, I think that these are the things that we need to develop, learning from the lessons that we have heard about, previous attempts to build a better model of trade in the world. So I'll stop there, Lloyd, and I'm sorry if I overshot my time.
That is perfectly fine. Look, we've got a question or a comment there that I will just read out from Patty Rundle, which I think touches on the last bit that you were mentioning there, which says a big problem from our IBFAM's perspective, working on UN health and safety and Codex training standards to prevent harmful marketing has been the corporate personhood legal concept, of course, started in the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution, giving corporations similar rights to individuals and restricting company activities and infringement of these rights, taking away life, liberty, and property. So, I mean, that's touching on some of the criticism that you were mentioning there, of course, which is around this problem with the concept that workers are often legally treated worse than corporations, which end up getting these legal personalities and kind of swan around the world pretending that they are harmed whilst they harm huge numbers of people. I mean, do you think that it is possible to make some of those kinds of reforms in the system, or is it a case that we just have to fight this country by country, workplace by workplace, or are we able to get kind of big wins?
I think it's a lot of it's all of those. Now, first, I have to say that the problem we have today is that the architecture of impunity of corporations in the world is such that they were able to have hard laws that would enforce their rights as investors. Meanwhile, workers and labor rights would have to rely on soft laws, in order to push for their rights. These are mostly, when we talk about soft laws, obviously these are things that are not mostly voluntary, non-binding, if you like, So that's the first problem that has to be addressed. And I don't think that can be addressed inside trade agreements. I know that the American trade union movement has been experimenting on this with the MCA, the experience in the MCA. But for example, in the IPEF and the ones they're pushing for in other free trade agreements, there is a problem of coming up with labor clauses in a free trade agreement that's actually designed to hollow out the economy of a country. That's very dangerous. In that sense, labor clauses can only deodorize a really, really bad agreement and even divide the movement between those who would support a labor clause, even if it is a bad free trade agreement, or those who would not, because it is a bad free trade agreement. So finally, my last point is that I think what we need to do is to push for hard laws in our countries, and as well as at the global level. And this is why my union, and together with other unions around the world, and other activists around the world, are pushing for legally binding rules for transnational corporations in the United Nations system.
Perfect. Look, thank you very much. Look, I've got two more questions here, and that's so far all we've got. I'm going to read them both out because I think they're pretty similar, and then I'll come to the other panelists, I think, to maybe say some further up remarks as well. So I've got a question here from Liz May. She says, thanks very much for such a fascinating discussion. It seems almost impossible today that the kind of radical thinking of the International Trade Organization could or would be proposed. It would be dismissed as economically naive or similar. How much is this due to the teaching of economics and the dominance of economists in policy making? And the other question that I have here is one of the ones that we thought of before, which is saying, do you see any opportunities in today's geopolitics for countries in the South, their global allies, to achieve real change in the trade system? We've seen, of course, delays in the Doha round because of demands people putting in for some reform, but they were relatively limited. Is it naive for us to think that we can break this dominance of economics in the policy making cycle, or can we break through? I wondered if we can go from the top again, Francine. I wonder if there's anything, or well, anyone actually of our panelists, but I'll go to Francine first. What's your thought? Is it that this is nice history, but doesn't really offer us any kind of hope because we've moved so far on it now, and the homogeny of thinking is so great that we can't challenge it, that the hegemony of thinking is so great that we can't challenge it? Or are there some historical but also present day examples where we can learn from?
My inclination is always to try to be optimistic, but that's a hard position to take in response to these questions. And I guess what the lessons of history are not obvious, how they apply to today. But I do think in the case of the ITO and the GATT, you do see that so-called radical thinking was often acknowledged, legitimized. Was it acted on? There were always barriers. There are always other things that came along to impede actual, implementation of policies or practices that would generate results that would be meaningful. And I think, you are right you pick up on a really important point about these orthodoxies and how they become so entrenched, and they apply to all kinds of areas, not just to economics or the global trade system. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to keep questioning those orthodoxies and asking, in some ways, very simple, but I think fundamental questions. Who benefits from these orthodoxies, right? Who are the winners in all of this? Who's telling these stories? And I think, and also the work I've done, the history of peace, that's the constant refrain. Oh, those are not realistic ideas. They're too far-fetched. And yet when you keep plugging away, what was once seen as radical or far-fetched or even delusional, they can become actually part of the mainstream. And I was encouraged by Joshua's comments, and actually also picking up on Abhijit's comments about the importance of narratives. So you have to keep crafting those narratives and promoting them, and making clear that there's other narratives that exist. There's a tension. They need, all narratives need to be listened to. But I'll stop there. But about the geopolitics. So in my work on the history of the GATT, ostensibly the global South should have been able to dominate the organization because of their numerical kind of majority. They constitute a majority. And that there are so many differences amongst them, so that they often were not an effective alliance overall, because they don't all have exactly the same interests. So I think to put your hope in the global South creating the G77, this always effective geopolitical alliance, the historical record shows how fragmented and fraught it can be, and how there are competitions for leadership and to advance their own interests within that movement.
Yes, I mean, my area, of course, of negotiation before I came into politics, sustainable development at the UN, and very often the G77 group really ended up not really representing coherent interests of some of the poorest countries. You had China in there as well that would often be pulling strings, and the reality is that there's probably 2 or 3 different caucuses there of different schools of thinking, economically, climate change, for human rights as well. But as that was mentioned earlier, that can be problematic in its own right, and that actually probably leads to a weaker global South. My view has always been, but not coming from the global South, I have to not push this too hard, that it probably would be better if there were just 3 distinct groupings that could come up with separate points and separate negotiations, and then sometimes come together when their interests are shared, but not at the current situation where it allows the biggest of the G77 to constantly dominate the rest of the G77. I'm not saying there aren't other failures and maybe advantages to that, but that would always been my perception. But I of course represented an EU member state, so it wasn't my place to tell others how to organise, although I thought it would be more effective for them. Abhijit, you've got your hand up and would quite like to answer this one, and I would love to come to you.
Okay, 2 quick points. We have a good illustration in the recent past where the Global South actually came together around some important issues in agriculture negotiations. and managed to stonewall what the US and European Union were attempting. I refer to 2003, when a coalition led by Brazil, Argentina, and India. And let's bear in mind that Brazil, Argentina on one side and India on the other side had very divergent interests in agriculture. These countries led a coalition of almost, it's called G20, but of more than 30 countries. And for about 5-6 years, they were the key players at the Doha round in agriculture negotiating table. So Global South, if it joins hands, realizes that it has more interests in common and less in common with the developed countries, Global South, I am very optimistic, can still be a powerful force at the negotiating table. I just had one quick response on the multi-stakeholder model. Patty, you rightly said that multi-stakeholder model really is not appropriate. But the problem that we are seeing is a very concerted attempt by different players, including the WTO Secretariat, to introduce a multi-stakeholder model at the WTO, whereby big corporate entities who have opposed attempts by developing countries to tax electronic transmissions, who opposed attempts of more than 100 developing countries to have a TRIPS waiver, they now get a seat in WTO discussions. So the multi-stakeholder model, which you say, Patty, is inappropriate. Unfortunately, the WTO seems to be treading that path, which to my mind will make the system more asymmetric, more imbalanced. Thank you for your questions.
Absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much for that. I will come, of course, next to Intan, but I'm going to also, while we're doing this, just read out some of the other ones that we get through so that you can bundle it up. Of course, Patty does mention that there has been a victory at Kodak's last month, but only after exposing the upper hand pressures exerted by the US on developing countries, and some links there on baby milk action archives. And we also have Alan Kumar in London. Is it possible to explain the global labour arbitrage that emerged during the second globalization without centering radical capitalism? Castes in South Asia, for example, is a key way of labouring bodies are getting mobilized for the accumulation of capital in the global north. It's a complex statement / question that I will need to reflect on a bit to get my head around it, but I'm sure the other panelists will be able to come in as they wish. Intan, on those broader set of questions that we're answering, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, just a little bit about, I think, with struggles and resistance, I agree with Abhijit. When we talk about history about Global South resistance, we do have to remember that, the backlash, I should say the reactionary response from the Global North, we have to take that into account, right? So every time Global South resistance, including those, by the leaders, were done, the response by the Global North were creating huge impact, right? So if those powerful Global North reactionary response didn't happen, then we should think about what would have happened, right? And so there's a lot of opportunities, or there's a lot of alternative scenarios that could have happened if those reactionary responses didn't happen. And so I think we have to think about future scenarios where these things can happen under different circumstances, the South-South alliances. Especially, we have to focus our attention with anti-imperialist struggles from below. And, with grassroots movements, I think, people in the working class, and I'm talking about the working class in an inclusive as an inclusive group, not just industrial workers, of course, but where they lead the struggles. And this have happened. Of course, we have a lot to learn from the communes in Venezuela, the landless peasants and movement in Brazil, factory occupations in Argentina, and so on. I think, rather than saying then, this have a lot of limitations, that their interests are often clashing and so on. I think the opportunities for solidarity should be prioritized, and people from below have to be at the front of the movement. I think that's my remarks, and we have a lot to learn from these movements.
I can see, Joshua, you've got your hand up, and I know you've got to head off to the airport shortly and might have an unstable connection. So do you want to go now? And then I know Francine's got her hand up, and then I will probably try and wrap up after that. Joshua.
Yeah, just a quick point, and please allow me not to use my video anymore in order to save on bandwidth. I think it's important. Yes, it's important that we look at the struggles of the global South. But let's not forget that when we talk about the globals of the global South, you are actually looking at governments who are very repressive in many cases against the working class, its own working class. In fact, they are mobilizing their seemingly anti-global North rhetoric, in order to, while at the same time while using those kind of rhetoric, they're hiding the fact that they are repressing their own people. And I know that because I'm from the Philippines. The second point is that I also think that even the struggles of the working class in the global South, while that's very, very important that we work together, including together hand in hand with those in the global North, building solidarity among the working class in itself is a struggle. Ironically, in a situation where we have all the technology, where we can communicate, almost instantly anywhere around the world, even if you're, sitting somewhere around the world, the fact is, I believe that the global labor movement has yet to develop a really robust model for global solidarity that will allow us to rise above our differences even in terms of not just ideology, but even in terms of race, ethnicity, and nationality. So those are very, very big challenges.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that. And then I guess for the final word, Francine, over to you.
Well, it probably isn't the best final word, but I want to thank Joshua. I think those last comments are really important and so helpful moving forward. But I also want to build on a point that Itan was making, a really important point about the reactionary, oppressive response to resistance. And that resistance, which is, so productive and so constructive and so important and so legitimate, and how in that reaction, and we need to always be challenging that reactionary response. And I'm struck, if history is valuable, and how those stories, those episodes, moments of resistance, or thinking about a different priorities, or noting how the trade system has been so unjust and harmful, in that global South actors can be portrayed by global North or Western actors as dangerous and threatening and not following the rules. They always find ways to undermine. It's not just to dismiss the kind of radical conception, but to undermine their purpose as somehow betraying some larger cause that we all share in, which I think is a really twisted logic at work there, but you hear it all the time.
Fantastic. Look, I think that's I really appreciate everyone for coming along to this webinar. I really appreciate Trade Justice Movement for hosting it. And of course, trade justice movement brings together these very struggles that we've been talking about: trade unions, environmentalists, people who want to see a world focused on people and planet, and not just on pure profit. It was, as we've heard, possible, but it was stymied at the last moment. And my belief is it is still possible. Campaigns from people across the world have managed to change the course of trade arrangements. We see now the potential rolling back of things like the Energy Charter Treaty. And why do we see that? Not just because they are awful things that put forward capital over our environment, but that the populations of many countries are getting to a stage where they are fed up of being ruled by a economic elite that fundamentally sees their life worse than it was in the past. And I do think that we will see change, but we will need to keep pushing because the forces on all sides are strong. Thank you everyone for coming, and I hope that you will enjoy the other sessions that are coming up. Good night, or good day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.